Ik dan dit dan dapat separat tabu. Ik dan ramgocho. Meu naam Hans Peter van Hoofddorp. Esse menino vários, não fica tipo rua. É não fica como Engels, mas não fica tipo rua. É moest dat. Ik moest English. I have to speak in English. I'm sorry, I forgot. I have a lot of languages in my head. I grew up speaking 4 languages. When I was a small child, till I was about 10 years old, I lived in Nepal, which is a small country in the foothills of the Himalayas between Tibet and China. And I had to speak different languages there. I went to an English school, so I had to speak English. But I didn't live in a big city, I lived in a small village somewhere in the middle of the mountains. And the kids there, they barely went to school, they couldn't speak anything except Nepali, so when I was playing outside with my friends, I had to speak Nepali with them. So that was English and Nepali. But my parents, of course, were not English, were not Nepali, my father was Dutch. But my mother is from Finland. And at home we usually spoke English, my mother would maybe speak some Finnish with me. But when I came on holiday to Holland or to Finland, my grandparents didn't speak a word of English. None of them. So here in Holland I had to learn to speak Dutch with my grandparents here, and then when I went to Finland I had to learn to speak Finnish. And that's pretty complicated. You start to mix languages up. It's not easy learning 4 languages, knowing 4 languages. Well, you all know it, you're learning languages here at school. And it would be much easier if everywhere in the world we just spoke 1 language. That would be much easier. But we don't. And have you ever wondered why we don't? I never really wondered about it as a kid, because I grew up and my parents, they gave me a children's Bible, and I would read the stories in the children's Bible, and that had a pretty good story for how we got all these different languages. You probably know the story. It's about the Tower of Babel. And that story explains the origin of all the different languages we have. Now, in case you don't know the story, I'm going to read it for you. It's just a small piece from the Bible, and it explains why there are so many different languages on earth. And I'm going to read an old version of the Bible, the King James Version from 1611. So it's an old version, and you'll see it's old-fashioned. It's obviously old-fashioned English, but I think you'll understand it pretty well. This is Genesis 11, and it goes, "And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn it thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and they had slime for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city, and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which children of men had builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth. They left to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. And from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth." So the story is actually that all these different languages that we have are basically a punishment from God. God punishes people because they wanted to do something that they shouldn't have done. They wanted to build a tower that would reach into heaven. Here you can see what remains of that tower. So this is in Babylon. In Babylon we have, it's called a I don't remember what it's called. It's called a ziggurat. And you can see the construction of how it probably would have looked. Anyway, God punishes the people because he didn't want them to do stuff that people shouldn't really do. They could do too much. He had to take them down a notch. So he made them all speak different languages. They couldn't understand one another, and then they scattered all over the earth, and we have all these different languages and different countries and cultures. Well, that's a pretty good story, but it's not really true, I think. And how did we find that out? Well, this man here, so William Jones, he was a judge, an English judge. And back in those days, England had colonies. The most important colony was India. And he was sent to work in India as a judge. Now, the Indian people, they have a very rich and old culture, so they all had their own systems of law. And they didn't just want some English people to come by and say, this is the law from now on. So they had to find out, how can these two law systems work together and be melded together? But these English didn't speak the Sanskrit language, the language that all these laws were codified in. So Sir William Jones decided to learn Sanskrit, which is a very old Indian language. It looks a bit like the language I started with, which was Nepali. I started speaking Nepali. The second language I spoke with you was Finnish. And Sanskrit is related to Nepali. And when he was studying this here in Europe, he had studied also various different languages, Persian, all the European languages, and he started to see similarities between the languages of Europe and the languages, this ancient Hindu language of Sanskrit. So in 1784, he wrote a letter. He wrote an article about this. This is what he said. The Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, both in the roots of the verbs and in the forms of the grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed, that no philologer could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. So he saw, looking at the languages, that they are pretty similar. They really do look alike. And that can't have been an accident. So he thought it probably is an ancient language that all three of these languages, and all English as well, and German and many other languages, have developed from. And actually he was right. So, in a sense, he knows the language that was around before all this language diversity started. In a sense, he's able to look. He knew that there was some language, like the language before the Tower of Babel, that people spoke commonly, and that was then scattered into different languages. Now, he didn't know this, but 200 years have gone by, and people have studied this, and I'm actually able to read a little story in that language. Now, bear in mind, this is incredible. It's a language that has been dead, and by dead I mean it hasn't been spoken by anyone in at least 4,500 years. So for 4,500 years, people haven't spoken this language. What's more incredible is, no one has ever written anything in this language. This was a language the people who spoke this didn't have an alphabet, they didn't write things, they didn't draw pictures of how we can't, maybe we can find some plots in the ground somewhere. That's not going to tell us how this language sounded. And still, we know. And it sounded a bit like this. The story is called The King and the God. And it goes like this. To rex est, so putlos est, so rex sonum event, so taso goitarm prutsksket, suchnus noi giotan, so goitar tom ek regen elrekvet, ich vesvo tegon verunon. I'll translate. There was a king. He was childless. He wanted a child. He asked his priest, "May a son be born to me?" The priest said to the king, "Pray to the god Verunos." Then it goes on. Sorex, Daibon, Verudon, Hypossessore, Nu, Daibon, Irketo. The king now approached the god Verunos to pray. Klutri moi, pater Verune. Hear me, Father Verune. Daivos Verunos, punta divos ecret. The god Verunos came from the heavens. Quid versi? What do you want? Verni suchnum. I want a son. Tot estu. Let it be so. Veukvet luikvos devos Verunos, said the bright god Verunos. Regos poti sunum gegon. The king's lady bore a son. Now, how did I do that? How could I speak a language that has been forgotten in the sands of time? Well, let's look at how Sir William Jones, how he figured out that languages were related. He looked at words and he saw that they resembled each other. For example, the word for father, German is vader, Old Norse, fatir, Old English, vader, Sanskrit, pitar, and Latin and Greek, pater. They all are pretty similar. Small differences. You see in the first three, it begins with an F or a V sound, and in the last three it begins with a P. Well, this F and this P isn't just something that we found in this word. Almost all other words that have F's and P's in them show the same regularity. So, for example, foot, fus, fotus, fot, is pat, pet, pot. Field, veld, vort, is tu, planus, platus. So the P and the F, that's quite regular. That's a regularity. That can't be accident. I mean, these are just 3 examples, but there are hundreds of them. So that's not an accident. And when you compare words like this, you can actually reconstruct. You can think what would have been likely as a word, as an origin, that all these words could have developed from. We know we have certain regularities in how language develops. So we know that it's possible for a P to develop into an F. It happened in Germany not that long ago. All the P's turned into F's. About 300-400, no, a bit longer. About 500 years ago in Germany, all the P's turned into F's. You know, we say paard, the Germans say Pferd. We say wapen, the Germans say Waffen. So that's a common thing. So that could have happened. So probably the P is the original form. Now there are many of this kind of regularities and laws, and you can reconstruct words. And you see there, down here, you see the reconstructed forms. Now that star, that asterisk, that means it's not a word that has ever been written anywhere, it's a reconstruction. And when you reconstruct all these words, that's how I'm able to read a story in this lost language. Now, the map here shows all the descendants of this Proto Indo European language. Not all languages in the world are descended from it, probably not even most, but most of the large languages are. So English, German, French, all of our European languages basically except Finnish, but most European languages, the languages spoken in Persia and India, they are all Indo-European languages. And we call it Indo-European because it covers everything from India to Europe. And of course with colonization, our European languages spread all over the globe. The light green countries here are languages where an Indo-European language isn't indigenous but is an official language. So in Africa, most African countries have, for example, French as a second official language. And the people might speak something else at home. Now this, you can see that Indo-European has basically taken over the world. This language family has taken over the world. And when you reconstruct these languages, you can make kind of a tree of descendants. So this is a nice picture of, this is how this works. We have the Indo-European, the stem of the big tree here, and from it branch out all these different languages. The people go to different places, they start to form their own languages, and it branches all out like this. And beside this big tree is tiny little tree over there. Those are the Finnic languages. That's the language tree. It's a different language family that Finnish is related to. So even though I speak a little bit Nepali, which is very far away, I would say that Finnish is the most exotic language I know because it's not Indo-European. It's the most different language from all the languages that I know. I speak a little German, maybe a little French, some English. And those are two trees. Now we don't know, maybe the root systems are connected somewhere. So maybe there is a common ancestor to Indo-European and the Finnic families, but we don't know that really. There are people who say that it is so. We don't really know. Now, how does this probably reminds you, by the way, of the Tree of Life by Darwin. And there are remarkable similarities between biological evolution, how organisms evolve, and how languages evolve. And I want to spend a little time talking about that because I think it's fun to know how language works, how languages spread, and how they evolve. And I'm going to compare language to a virus. Now, a virus, maybe, I hope you know what a virus is. A virus is nothing. A virus is just a bit of DNA, nothing more. A virus isn't a living thing. A virus can't do anything. It can't move, it can't take in energy. It's just DNA that's lying around somewhere. It has a little protective thing around it, but it's basically just DNA lying around. So you can't say it's alive, it can't reproduce. Now, how do viruses reproduce? They reproduce by parasitizing, for instance, on us humans. So when you come along, someone coughs into your face, this virus comes into your system, and then the virus will go into your cells. And your cells have large copying mechanisms to copy DNA. And that's what the virus needs to propagate itself. It can't copy itself, it needs to use our copying systems. So it goes into the cell, and then the cell will think, hey, good, a piece of DNA. I'm in the business of copying DNA. This looks pretty good. Let's copy this. And your own cells will start copying the virus like mad, and that's how the virus will propagate itself, and it will jump out of the cell, and it will spread. And we've made a lot of little baby viruses. Now, language works basically in the same way. A word is nothing. A word is just scribbles on a piece of paper. In fact, there are words on this. These ancient Proto Indo Europese words. It's nothing. It doesn't do anything. This can't reproduce itself. This piece of paper can't make babies. It can't eat, it can't move, it can't do anything. Except when it parasitizes us. Because when I look at this paper, the words mean something to me. They jump into my brain. And in my brain, they're going to start to form new combinations. And I learn new words. And I'm going to use those words. So what these words are doing is they're using our brains to propagate themselves. That's why language is like a virus. And we think we use language, we think we speak. No, it's the words that are using us to propagate themselves. Now, I think you know, when you're learning a new language, you try to use words. For example, today you might learn the word Indo-European, and you might tell your family or your friends, I went to a lecture about Indo-European. What is Indo-European? Well, it's the ancestor language to all these other languages around the world. Some of you might not quite remember the word, so there might be little copying mistakes. So we have Indo-European, someone may perhaps say Indo-European. It's a small mistake, but it happens. That's how languages change, by the mistakes we make. Little children make mistakes. We're correcting them all the time. And when these mistakes, when you have a lot of mistakes, when people start copying each other's mistakes, that's when language really changes. Because normally nothing happens. You make a mistake, someone laughs at you, or doesn't even notice, and we go on. But sometimes these mistakes do get copied, and then we start to get a new language. Yeah, so that's exactly as with DNA. So you can get these mutations, and the mutations get passed on. Now, how fast do languages change? How fast does this happen? Well, I read you a piece of from the Bible from about 400 years ago. We've made some changes since then. English doesn't sound exactly the same, but you've probably understood most of it. So it's not that fast. But it is fast enough that you can notice. Probably, when you go to your grandparents, you think, they talk a bit old-fashioned. Probably. That's how fast language changes. In a couple of generations, you notice small differences. It's not enough to say, oh, it's a totally new language, but you notice differences. And what changes depends, so not all parts of language, not all words change, evolve just as fast. It turns out, the words you use the most are the least likely to change. And I think that's pretty logical, because the words you use most, you're the most familiar with, you're the less likely to make mistakes with. And also, when you do make a mistake, you're most likely to be corrected. But words that are difficult, that you don't use that much, that's where mistakes can happen. And we can calculate this, and we have historical evidence, and you can see that language words, about 10 to 20% of the vocabulary in a language will change over a period of about 1,000 years. Now that doesn't sound like much, but that's pretty much. So 10% is on the border of you being able to understand it. You can see this in action here. This is a part of that Bible story I quoted. And I read from the left here, the King James Version, 1611. On the right we have a little bit older version, the Wycliffe Bible from 1395. And that's already getting pretty weird. So you can see there, and he said, lo, the people is en o language is to all, and they have begun to make this. It's a bit weird. So you see here that the difference 400 years ago, we still pretty much get it. 600 years ago, it's starting to get difficult. Okay. Now, I hope you can see this. The red words are words that are exactly the same, 600 years ago and today. And you can see it's exactly those words which are most common. Words like and he, and the. Those words don't change. Those words don't tend to change, because they're very common. Other words, they change more easily. Now, a lot of the black words, probably the spelling is a little different. Probably they spoke it in the same way that is spoken today. I'm not an expert on this, I don't know. So the change is probably a little less than would be suggested here. But you can see the principle that words you use a lot, they change faster than words that you don't use that much. Now, okay, so we can make a family tree of languages, which looks a bit like this. The Proto Indo European, and then we have the Germanic and the Celtic languages, and the Tocharian, Indo-Iranian, Anatolian. You can make a whole language tree like this. So you get a great diversity of languages. Now, how do languages spread? Well, it doesn't. Let's imagine, let's look at the map of Nepal. So this is the country where I grew up, Nepal. And the different colors here are different languages. And these are only the major languages in Nepal. So Nepal is a country where at least 123 languages are spoken. It's a country maybe 4 times the size of the Netherlands, but they speak 123 different languages. How come? Well, look at the landscape. It's a very mountainous landscape. You have lots of remote villages. The roads are bad, they get washed away in the monsoon. These are very remote areas, so you can imagine that the people in one valley have very little contact with people in another valley. And when you don't talk to each other that much, that's when languages get a chance to diverge, to develop into different, to develop in different ways. Now let's look at a map of Europe. So imagine ancient times. Imagine, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, Bronze Age. Now, Europe has less mountains than Nepal. We do have some. We have the Alps and the Carpathians and the Balkans, and I don't know. We have all kinds of mountains, but large parts of Europe, and everything from Russia to, say, North France, the great Northern European plain, it's pretty much no obstacles. And you had all kinds of regional dialects. So what you had is that people would probably be able to understand the person in the next village, and they'd be able to understand the person in the next village, and maybe if you traveled a couple of villages on, it would get harder and harder to understand people, because it would be more and more, the languages they would speak would be more and more different from your own language. But really, if you want to get really different languages, I mean, you need barriers. Now today, barriers are of course borders. I'm going to show you a little movie by Professor De Zwaan. And he's giving a lecture in Dutch about languages and how they... Mr. De Zwaan, he is asking, waarom is het Twents een dialect en het Nederlands niet? So what's the difference between all these different dialects that are spoken when people live in different villages? And what's the difference between that and a real language? And that's what he's going to explain.
In het midden zit een zwart gat dat alles naar zich toezuigt wat ook maar enigszins in de buurt komt. En dat black hole, dat is natuurlijk het Engels.
Waarom is Twents een dialect en het Nederlands een taal? De Universiteit van Nederland presenteert taalsocioloog professor Dr. Abram De Zwaan.
Er worden op de wereld tegenwoordig zo'n 6000 talen gesproken. Misschien zijn het er 5000, misschien zijn het er 7000. En die talen worden gesproken door groepen die elkaar geen van allen verstaan. Dat is natuurlijk een wonderlijke situatie. En toch valt de mensheid niet uiteen in 6000 onbegrepen groepen, maar zijn er verbindingen tussen al die mensen. En die verbindingen die zijn gelegd door meertaligen. Er zijn altijd mensen die meer dan één taal kennen, en dat zijn dus de mensen die een brug leggen tussen die groepen. Dus de meertaligen zijn volkomen wezenlijk voor het voortbestaan van de mensheid. Maar het interessante is dat die verbindingen zijn helemaal niet lukraak. Integendeel, die vormen een heel geordend, sterk, efficiënt, hiërarchisch systeem. Door de verbindingen die meertaligen tussen de taalgroepen leggen, heb je eigenlijk een soort, ik noem het een galactisch stelsel, een soort uitspansel van talen die om elkaar heen cirkelen. En op het allereerste niveau heb je eigenlijk al meteen 90% van alle talen. En die worden maar gesproken door hooguit 10% van alle mensen. Dat zijn de kleine talen, dat zijn de schriftloze talen, dat zijn dus de talen van het geheugen, waar je kunt niks opschrijven, je hebt geen harddisk om op te saven, je saved het op je eigen softdisk, het geheugen. Het zijn talen die vrijwel alles moeten ontberen waaraan je denkt wanneer je aan een moderne taal denkt. Ze hebben geen televisie en geen parlement en geen woordenboeken. Al die dingen zijn er niet. En ze zijn vaak, bevinden zich in nogal kwijnende omstandigheden. Maar heel veel van die mensen leren een andere taal. Wat ze dan tegenwoordig leren is de taal van de politie, van de landbouwconsulent, van de belastingambtenaar. Het is de taal misschien van de stad op een dag lopen afstand, waar je een baantje kunt vinden en cash, geld kunt verdienen. Het is de taal waar mijn Chimbu-mensen hun koffie in verkochten in de stad. Dan hebben ze een zak van die rode bonen mee. En dan liepen ze daarmee naar de stad om het te verkopen. En daarvoor moet je al een beetje die centrale taal kennen. Dus hier heb je die noem ze maar perifere taaltjes. Hier allemaal. En hier ook die streepjes betekenen dat ze niet geteld zijn. En hier heb je als een soort planeten waarom mandjes draaien de centrale talen. En de meeste daarvan zijn talen van een staat, zoals het Nederlands. En zegt er zijn er zo'n 200, ongeveer zoveel als leden van de Verenigde Naties. Maar dat zijn nou echt talen waaraan wij denken als je taal zegt. Dus die hebben woordenboeken en die hebben regels. En die worden in het parlement gesproken en op de televisie. En er is een literatuur en er is een geschiedenis en archieven en bibliotheken. Je kunt het zo gek niet verzinnen. Al die dingen hebben die centrale talen. En dat zijn stevige, dat zijn robuuste talen, want ze worden verdedigd door de overheid, door de staat. Maar als deze mensen een nieuwe taal leren, dan leren ze een supercentrale taal. Een taal waarmee je over hele continenten kunt communiceren. Dus bijvoorbeeld in West-Afrika leren heel veel mensen die Senegalees of Malië, die leren Frans. Want daarmee kun je het halve continent en bovendien de hele Franse cultuur kun je bereiken. Dat zijn wereldtalen. Voor de communicatie op lange afstand. En die hebben eigenlijk de functie van zonne, want daar draaien weer planeetjes omheen. Ik denk dat er 12 of 10 of 13 van die wereldtalen, van die supercentrale talen bestaan. Om te beginnen, en dat is niet toevallig, Europese voormalig koloniale talen. Laten we even kijken. Portugees, Spaans, Frans, Engels, natuurlijk ook Duits, al heeft zich dat vroeg moeten terugtrekken uit zijn koloniën na 1918. Russisch, trouwens ook een koloniale taal, dat vergeten we wel eens, maar in Oost-Azië in Midden-Azië zijn ze het helemaal niet vergeten. En dan krijg je Arabisch en Hindi en Chinees en Japan en Maleis, wat we nu Bahasa Indonesië noemen. En omdat ik het zo'n sympathieke taal vind, Swahili, wat in Oost-Afrika is een Bantu-taal die functioneert als een verkeerstaal tussen al die vele Afrikaanse en veelal Bantu-talen. Dat zijn de zonnen van ons melkwegstelsel. Maar zoals in elk galaxie, in elk melkwegstelsel, in het midden zit een zwart gat dat alles naar zich toezuigt wat ook maar enigszins in de buurt komt. En dat black hole, dat is natuurlijk het Engels. In het midden van het wereldtalenstelsel zit die Engelse taal.
Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. So he explains the difference between dialects, regional languages, and what we would call a real language. So languages are protected by governments. They are taught in schools. So here in the Netherlands we might have people in Groningen speak different from the people in Limburg. That's all okay. In school they have to speak the same algemeen beschaafd Nederlands. And that's a language when it's protected in school. So these borders are very important in today's world. Because today these borders determine what language you are taught in school. So they determine how languages evolve separately. Now in ancient times it was a little different because we didn't have these artificial borders, but there were natural borders. So you have the Alps, the Caucasus, the Carpathians, the Ural Mountains, the Balkans. All these are big mountain ranges, inhospitable areas. That's where the boundaries where languages would develop in different directions. But of course you didn't only have boundaries. The blue line here is the Rhine River, and which more or less is continuous with the Danube River. And rivers are like a highway. Certainly in the ancient world, rivers were the highways. They were transportation highways. There was no faster and easier way to get from one place to the other than by a river. So rivers, that river that gave a corridor through which languages can spread, and the mountains act like barriers for languages to spread. Now, I've told you a little bit, I've explained how languages evolve, how it works. I've read to you a little sample of Indo-European. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the Indo-Europeans. So what do we know about the culture of the people who spoke? Do we know where they live? What do they think? What can we tell just by looking at the language that we can reconstruct? Indo-European. I'm going to talk about the people who spoke Indo-European, and I'm going to cover two questions largely. So I'm going to talk about what do we know about these people, what kind of lives do they live, what can we tell about that without being able to dig them up and see and have archaeological evidence, or very little archaeological evidence. And the second thing I'm going to end on, I think, is how come this Indo-European language, which was spoken by a very small tribe of people, clan of people, 6,000 years ago, why this language spread over the entire world. And for those of you who are interested in this, if you go home and you want to know a bit more about the Indo-Europeans, I recommend that you go to YouTube, and there you can just type in Indo-Europeans, and you'll probably basically get this straight away, which is a documentary about how this language spread into Europe. I'm going to just show the intro to give us a little feel about what this is about.
Four 4,000 years ago, the last Stone Age hunter-gatherers are living on the remote coastlines of Europe. Now, they will disappear from the human journey. Warriors are taking possession of the land. For this child, these are the creatures of a dream. She has never seen a horse. She's never heard of a wagon with wheels. The strangers make an offering to the ocean. The arrow is tipped with bronze. But their most powerful weapon is not metal. It's an idea. They have a chief, and they do what they are told. Now, they cover Europe with a new society. It will create our world, with all its glory and its horror.
Okay, I'm going to stop that documentary there. So, this presents a rather violent image of how Indo-Europeans conquered Europe. They were warriors, they had chiefs who they listened to, and who they obeyed. And they had weaponry that was very advanced for its age. They had bronze weaponry. Now that image, that violent image, is probably it's probably not been that bad. It's not that nasty. So it was probably a bit more peaceful, and I'm going to come to that later. Now, look at these words. So I need to talk about how do we know anything about these people based on nothing, based on words that we speak today, and that we can trace back to an ancient language. Now look at this list of words: an armadillo, a sagebush, a cactus, a lasso, a saddle, a six-gun, a chuck wagon. What does this list of words tell you? What does it make you think about? Cowboys, probably Clint Eastwood in a movie in the West, somewhere in the southern states of the United States, probably end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. I mean, there's no, in this list, you have no telephone, no mobile phone, no cars, so probably they didn't have that, but we do know they did have 6 guns, so they carried pistols. So you can tell something, just from looking at the kind of words people use, you can tell something about the environment they lived in. Cactus, they have cactuses, well we know they lived, it has to be in a desert somewhere. So just by, if you have a list of words that people used, you know a lot about their lives, or you can tell a lot about their lives. So I'm going to run through some things that we know about the Indo-Europeans. For example, these are words they have for different animals. Otters, beavers, wolves, deer, hedgehogs, goose, ducks, eagles, bees. That tells us they lived in an environment pretty similar to ours, at least when it comes to climate. So there's nothing tropical in there. And there's nothing deserty. I mean, there are no lions, it's not in Africa. There are no palm trees, there are no lions, zebras. So we know it's a temperate zone environment. They lived in a temperate zone environment. What else can we tell? Well, they didn't just have names for animals. We know they had domesticated animals. Oh, is that going too fast? No. Okay, so there's more evidence, and we can pin down where they lived to this area. So the area where the language was spoken, the Proto Indo European language was spoken, was here in the steppes of Russia, Ukraine. It's roughly the area where now the rebels, the Ukrainian rebels are fighting to join Russia. So that area, that's what we're talking about. That's where it all started. Now, these people, they also had domesticated animals. They had words for cow, for sheep, pig, and dog, and we know these were not wild animals because they also had words for cattle, and for to milk, and to weave, and wool, and we know they used milk products, so they have sour milk, they have whey. So we know that they had animals. We also know that they had carts, because they have words for wheel, for hub, for axle, for yoke, fill, ox. These are all parts of wagons. So we know they rode around, or at least they had wagons and probably towed by oxes. We know they had words for field, for wheat, for barley, and a word for grinding grain. So we know that they also had agriculture. We know they had a word for to brew, and we know they had a word for mead. Mead is a honey drink, alcoholic honey beverage. So we knew that these people liked to drink. We knew they had 2 words for fart. They had 1 word for loud fart and 1 word for soft fart. So they were pretty messy people. It's not really relevant, but it's fun. We know they lived in households. Those households consisted of families, probably with a male as the head of the household. They were organized in clans. These clans had leaders. So we know that about their society as well. And we also know that males played a big part in their lives, and that they had a male sky deity. I'll come to that later as well. Now when we look at how they thought, so it's pretty patrimonial. It's the male is the head of the household. We can tell that by looking at this, for example. So we know they have words for son's wife, brother's wife, husband's wife, husband's brother, husband's sister. They have words for all those. They don't have words for daughter's husband, sister's husband, wife's mother. So what does that tell us? They have words for one thing and they don't have words for another. Well, it tells you that probably when they married, the woman would join the family or the clan of her husband, and he would be considered her family. So she had, she belonged to that family, but the husband didn't belong to his wife's family because they didn't have words for the wife's side of the family. So this was a pretty male-dominated society. Now there are reasons for that. I'll come to that later, I think. We also know about their mythology. Now, the same way that you can reconstruct words, you can also reconstruct myths. Because you can compare, okay, what kind of myths do we have in India? What kind of myths do we have in old Norse mythology? And when you compare that from all around the world, you can also, in the same way that you can reconstruct old words, you can reconstruct old myths. So we know that they have a sky god. Their creation myth is about twin brothers. So again, it's very male-dominated, a male sky god, twin brothers. These twin brothers, they sacrifice a cow. So a cow is very important to them. They sacrifice a cow, and different parts of the cow become the different parts of the world. And then they have another myth with a cow. They have also a third man, they call him. So you have the twin brothers, but there's a third man. And this third man, he also walks around with a cow. This cow gets stolen, and he takes revenge, and he murders the one who stole the cow, and he gets the cow back, and everything is fine again. So we know that cattle stealing was also a big issue for them. So that's things that we know from their mythology. Now, why did it spread? Why did this culture, why did it spread? It comes down to two things. They had two things that made them unique in the world. It's not that their language was better, it's not that these people were superior to other people, that they were stronger, better fighters, nothing of that. They were just in the right place at the right time. And they were in the right place to share two innovations. They had the horse and horseback riding, and they had ox wagons. Now, wagons is something that they weren't unique in. If you think about ancient inventions, what was very important to humankind? Two things usually come to mind. So you ask about what's the most important invention in human history. People will probably say fire, or they will say the wheel. And these two inventions are, fire is very old. The wheel is a little less old. It's about 6,000, 7,000 years old. Now, the wheel was such an incredible invention that once it was invented somewhere, it spread almost immediately all over the world. So in the archaeological record, it's not possible to see where the wheel was invented, because it just spread so quickly. And that doesn't happen with anything else. Any other inventions around the world, they spread very slowly. The wheel was instantaneous. It was just such an incredibly good idea, and you just had to look at it, you had to see someone use it, and you knew, okay, I can use that, I can do that, something with that. But what the Indo-Europeans had is they had horseback riding. These were the people who domesticated the horse. And that gave them a huge advantage over different people. I'm not sure, I'm a bit short on time, so I'm not going to talk that much about horse domestication. But it's a pretty amazing thing. I would have liked to talk about this more. We know from looking at ancient horse DNA, for example, that mares, the female horses, have been domesticated many times. There's large diversity in DNA in female horses. But we also know that stallions have only been domesticated once. It's only one time in the history of humankind have we been able to take a wild horse, a wild male horse, a wild stallion, and domesticate it. And that one stallion is the ancestor to all horses we know today. There are no wild horses left, they're all extinct. Even horses that live in the wild today used to be domesticated horses that have then escaped. So this one horse is the ancestor of all horses. Now, why is that? That's because male horses are pretty aggressive. Horses live in bands, and one male will have a harem of females. And young males will have to fight many times with older horses in order to get women. So they're very, very aggressive animals. And it's not easy to catch them, and it's not easy to domesticate. They're wild, they're unruly. They don't like to be controlled. Mares are different because mares are used to being controlled by a male stallion. So it's a smaller step for a mare to be controlled by humans. But for a stallion, it's a huge step. So if you think about it, this one male stallion that was domesticated had to be pretty exceptional. In what way? Well, probably that one male horse was a bit of a loser. Probably he was a bit meek. He wasn't as aggressive as the rest. And probably because he was meek and not so aggressive, he probably couldn't get a girl. So from his perspective, it was a really smart thing to let humans domesticate him, because then he didn't have to go get the girls himself, the humans would do it for him. So that was a pretty smart horse. He chose a different strategy from the rest. And that one horse is the ancestor of all the other horses we have. Now, primarily, so horses lived here in the, let's see, where's, okay. Horses live in the steppe. That's the place where they live. It's difficult to catch them. You can see they run away easily there, and imagine if you're on foot, it's going to be pretty impossible to catch them. So, okay, there are ways of doing it. You can drive them into a canyon somewhere and then lock them up, and you can do that, but it's difficult. And people had already been hunting horses for a long time. Horses were an important part of their diet. And when they captured horses, probably it was for meat. So they just kept a breeding population of horses so they could eat. And it probably took, and it's very difficult to say this, but at least a couple of hundred years, possibly much longer, before they were able to domesticate a horse so that it could be ridden. Because to ride a horse is very different from keeping it somewhere in a stable or somewhere in, keep it locked up somewhere. It's a very different thing to ride a horse, because you have to be able to control a horse. And that's where these Indo-Europeans came up with the invention that changed their and our history. They invented this little thing. Does anyone know what this is? Exactly, it's a bit. It's a horse bit. You put this into the mouth of the horse. And that's how you control a horse. Because then you can put reins onto these rings, and then you can steer the horse. How do you do that? Well, it has this thing in its mouth, like this. And when you pull it, it hurts. So when you pull one side, it's going to hurt this side of his mouth. And he doesn't like that, so he's going to try to relieve the pressure by turning his head. And when he turns his head, his body turns, and he'll start moving in that direction. So that's how you control a horse. So the bit, this piece of technology, allowed the Indo-Europeans to control horses. And that was amazing. Now they had, for the first time in human history, you could travel long distances. You could easily travel long distances. Not only could they travel, it was much easier to catch horses. And not only horses, for example, if you have sheep, well, you can control, so a shepherd can control a flock of sheep that is about 200. So you can control about 200 sheep, with a sheepdog. And if you have a horse, that you can control much more. So you can control 500 sheep with a horse. Even more important are the distances you can go. These people lived on the steppe, which was a pretty difficult environment. I mean, it's nice and green. It looks all very nice. But if there are no rivers, you're not going to get water, and you're not going to survive long without water. So they could only move about 15 kilometers from a river at any time. That means large parts of the steppe were a territory where humans just didn't set foot. But with a horse, you can travel much longer distances. So you can take your herd of cattle or of sheep, and you can move them 50 kilometers inland, no problem. So you have much larger territory. So you can control more animals, you can have much larger herds, you can have much more herds, and that made these people incredibly rich. And of course they had the wagons to bring with them, so they could just put on the wagons, they could take food and provisions with them, they could take tents with them, and they could move into the steppes, and they could live there, and they'd have enough water to spend a couple of weeks, and then they'd have to move back to find more water somewhere. And that brought a whole new kind of economy to the steppes. Now, these people, I mean, they just exploded in it. This is from Mongolia. This is how it still exists. This kind of mobile herding economy still kind of exists in Mongolia. So you have these people, they have their tents, they take these tents on their wagons, they take all their livestock with them, and they go from one place to the next, and they have big herds, and well, today we consider them to be very poor, but back in the Bronze Age, these were incredibly wealthy people, compared to what others had, of course. Now, this brought with it, of course, all kinds of new problems. First of all, their attitudes had to change. Because when you're a forager, you live from day to day, sharing is very important. If your neighbor is hungry and you have some food, you'll share it with him. And tomorrow he'll share some of his food with you. But if you live like this, if you have cattle, then you have to have a very different mindset. Because it is vitally important that you keep a breeding population of cattle. You can't just eat all your cattle, because if you do, next year you'll have nothing. So if you're having a tough time, if you're having a hard time, your family is going hungry, you still have to have the self-discipline to say, no, that cow, we are not going to eat it. We're just going to have to be hungry. We'll have to make do, but it stays alive. Else we'll die next year. Another problem here is that they started to have large territories and they would migrate through these territories. And they wouldn't be the only ones. There would be very many families migrating, and you would pass through each other's territories, and you had to, that gives a potential for conflict. So you have to find ways to solve that conflict. Now that is exactly what they did. That is probably the reason why Indo-Europeans started to spread as the language that was used to resolve conflicts. So we remember this by Professor de Zwaan. He explained that people speak regional languages, but they usually learn a second language to be able to understand and communicate with people that live a bit farther away. Now, Indo-European probably was a regional language. So these clans would have their own variants of Indo-European, or maybe even other language, but they would learn a few words of Indo-European so that when they met each other there on the steps, they could talk it out. Of course, the language didn't just stay there in the steppes. It moved all across the world. Now there are two things that come into play. Language can spread peacefully and it can spread by the sword. So I have here two pictures. You can conquer people and force them to speak your language, or just eradicate them and live in their place. And you can develop a language, a regional language, so you can sell stuff to each other. Those are the two. And probably both were a little bit in play here. So we saw that part from the documentary where the Indo-Europeans came in as warriors to take over the land from the foragers in Northern Europe. Well, it was probably a bit of a mix of both of those. Now, part of that resolving conflicts also meant that they had to have ways to do that. They had to have conventions. And here we get into something I think is quite interesting. And it's the guest-host relationship and the giving relationship in Indo-European. There are certain words that have developed into two meanings, but they are the same word. For example, the Greek word nemetai, that means to allot something, to give something, is, when you take the same word, in German means to take something, nehmen. And Greek and German aren't the only examples. So there are many languages, and in some of the languages the same word means to take, and in others it means to give. Which means that probably for the Indo-Europeans, giving and taking was the same thing. They didn't make a difference between giving and taking. It was the same action. Give and take goes at the same time. Another thing is that guest and host were also the same. They didn't make a difference between guest and host. So both come from the word gosti. You can see just about how in English that could develop into guest and into host, that same word, gosti. By the way, a ghost, this English word ghost, used to mean a visitor. So ghost is a visitor from another world. That's why the word ghost is ghost. It comes from the same word. And this was one of the very important religious parts of Indo-European life. That to give is to take, and a guest is a host. It's a relationship where you're both equal, and you're both the same. And this was very important to them. Now I have an example from Greek mythology. Spoke Indo-European, and then from there they moved into Europe, and they moved into Asia. And there was probably a bit of violence. I mean, there is evidence that they would go on raids, they would go on cattle raids, for example. They would capture cattle from their enemies. They had a big advantage because they had horses, so they could ride to their enemies, and they could go and get cattle very far away, so far away that the others wouldn't be able to get back and steal back their cattle. They would have trading posts, they would marry, but these guest-host relationship also gave them a way to live in, to make alliances with local tribes. So when they would move, for example, into what is now Germany, they would have an outpost there, but they wouldn't be automatically, make everybody their enemy. Usually, people see enemies as the other. So there's my tribe, and the other tribe is the enemy. Now, these Indo-Europeans, they thought in a different way. So for them, it wasn't important whether you were in their tribe or not, because they have lots of little tribes and lots of clans. The only thing that was important was, could you share this ritual where you could have a guest-host friendship and you would become equals? And that gave them the possibility to spread into different areas, not have to fight these people, to get these people to be their guests/hosts, exchange gifts, they would be seen as equals, and of course the people would often look up to them because these were fantastically rich people. They had horses, which allowed them to accumulate much more riches. They were able to give big funeral feasts. I mean, sometimes they would, when an important chief would die, they would slaughter 2,000 cows, and they would have everybody from all the clans there. They would come and they would feast, and there would be thousands of people for a week eating food sponsored by the host. And of course, that gives a lot of prestige. So that probably also played a big part in how Indo-European spread. And it's quite analogous to how today English has spread. So we all know from our lives English is a very important language in the world, and English, the spread of English, is part of it is of course violence. I mean, the British conquered all kinds of colonies and spread their language, so part of it is violence, but part of it is also, it's just cool to speak English. We look up to the Americans. They're the richest, they're the most advanced, we look up to them, we want to speak English as well. So it's become a very important regional language. Probably the same thing happened with Indo-European. All right, I think I've covered just about everything I wanted to cover. I want to leave you with a final thought. Because all of this, everything I've told you about their culture, about their customs, about their myths, their religions, all of that is pieced together from not much more, actually, from the words that we speak today. So it's our languages, the words that we use every day, the words that colonize our brains, that we think we are using, are in fact contain in them traces of the past. And if you look at those traces, you can know a lot about the past. So the words that you are speaking today, maybe in 1,000 years, someone will look at their language, and just by speaking the languages that we do today, we will be preserving an image of today for future generations. So language is a pretty amazing thing, and I hope, if you remember, if I've given you a sense of one thing, I hope it's that you see that language is quite worthwhile studying. Okay, I thank you very much for your time.